December 1944 saw some of the bitterest fighting of the Second World War. On December 14th, the German army launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes Forest. By the 18th, troops of the 101st and 82nd Airborne were surrounded in the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets were engaged in one of the most complex offensives of the war, the Budapest Campaign, a campaign that would eventually take more than 100 days and cost the Soviets some 320,000 casualties. And in the Pacific, Task Force 38, part of the U.S. Third Fleet, was caught in a surprise action so violent that 31 ships were damaged, including major damage to 5 U.S. aircraft carriers, and 3 U.S. destroyers were sunk, costing the lives of nearly 800 sailors and Marines, killed not by the Japanese, but by a violent tropical storm, because Mother Nature does not take a break for wars. Typhoon Cobra is often kind of lost in the noise of the war news of the day, yet it is a story of human drama with some outstanding acts of bravery. It's history that deserves to be remembered. On December 13th, as part of the preparation for the Battle of Luzon, part of the campaign to retake the Philippine Islands, 10,000 troops of the U.S. Army, supported by Philippine guerrillas, invaded the island of Mindoro. The purpose of the landing was to secure and establish airfields that would be within fighter range of planned landing areas on the island of Luzon. The Japanese forces on the island were small and overwhelmed. The battle only lasted 3 days. Task Force 38 consisted of 7 fleet aircraft carriers, 6 light aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 15 cruisers, and about 50 destroyers. Called Fast Carrier Task Force, Task Force 38 was the main striking force of the United States Navy in the Pacific War from January 1944 through the end of the war. The group had been conducting air operations against Japanese bases during the invasion of Mindoro, attempting to suppress Japanese defense of the island. For 3 days, the group's fighters and dive bombers attacked, destroying 269 Japanese aircraft, sinking merchant ships, and blasting airfields and railroads. The attacks had the desired effect, as the Japanese Navy and Air Force put up no organized attacks on the Mindoro invasion fleet, although kamikaze attacks did some damage. As a result of the fast pace of operations, the group was low on fuel, especially its destroyers, which had smaller tanks. It was considered imperative that all task force units be expeditiously refueled in order to facilitate more airstrikes planned for December 19th. The task force was given a rendezvous point some 300 miles east of Luzon, far enough away that the ships would be safe from the kamikaze attacks, to engage in refueling operations with 12 fleet oilers. As the day went along, the seas grew rougher, and a 20 to 30 knot wind made the fueling operation difficult. But the fleet was not aware of the danger ahead of them. Their task group relied on analysis from Fleet Weather Central at Pearl Harbor. Today, weather forecasters have satellite images and data that's all collected by computer, but in 1944, Fleet Weather Central was trying to predict weather across the vast Pacific Ocean with very few weather stations and only a few sporadic reports from ships and islands. That December, weather data was lacking information on an area 240 to 300 miles in diameter, and Fleet Weather Center did not know and could not warn Task Force 38 that a massive storm was centered in that blind spot. The fleet horologist was informed only of a tropical storm, very weak. But the difficulty with fueling only grew worse as swells increased. Multiple reports came in of hoses rupturing as ships pitched and rolled in the heavy seas. By 12:50 in the afternoon, the fleet commander, Admiral William F. Halsey, ordered a halt to the refueling operations. Despite the rough seas, concerns were still low. Halsey noted that the fleet had still received no outside warning of a typhoon. But the storm was only 120 miles away from his group. While Halsey called a conference aboard his flagship, the fast battleship USS New Jersey, many of his commanders were noting increased evidence of the storm to come. The situation was tense, as the fleet needed to refuel if it was to meet its commitments to conduct air attacks on the 19th. But the path and size of the storm was still unknown. When Fleet Weather Central predicted the storm would turn north, Halsey ordered the fleet to turn south, thinking that would take them to calmer waters. In fact, the erratic storm was following a different path than what had usually been seen in December Pacific storms. Unwittingly, Halsey had sent his fleet directly into the path of the storm. And many of the destroyers had not been refueled yet, making them top-heavy and low on ballast, increasing the danger in the swells. The fleet attempted refueling operations again the early morning of the 18th, but again the swells made the operation almost impossible, and Halsey had to call a halt. He contacted General Douglas MacArthur and informed him that the fleet would not be able to conduct the planned air attacks on December 19th. But the situation was worse than that. The storm was far larger than they had realized, and command had not grasped the severity of the situation until they were within 100 miles of a massive typhoon. By then it was too late to escape. The situation was exacerbated because the ships were still trying to maintain formation, still under orders to engage in refueling. Only at 11:45 did Halsey give the command to take most comfortable courses, meaning forget formations, and save your ships. As the barometer plummeted, the swells increased to over 70 feet. New Jersey was tossed about so badly that its captain was concerned it may not survive the storm. Visibility dropped to near zero. At broad noon, Halsey later said, I couldn't see the bow of my ship, 350 feet from the bridge. But he had an even graver concern. If New Jersey was struggling, then what did that mean for the much smaller destroyers? USS Monaghan was the last of the 8 Farragut-class destroyers built. Commissioned in January 1935, she had been on station at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. There she had rammed and sank one of 5 midget submarines that had been sent to attack ships in the harbor. She had screened the carrier Enterprise at the Battle of Midway, and later was part of the destroyer group that badly damaged the Japanese submarine I-68 after it fired the torpedo that eventually caused the sinking of the carrier Yorktown. The veteran ship served throughout the Pacific, from the Aleutians to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. That December, she had been assigned as an escort for 3 of the fleet oilers serving Task Force 38. Monaghan was low on fuel when the storm struck, and had likely released ballast that she was planning to fuel. The storm struck so quickly that she was not trimmed to ride it out. She would have been very high in the water. The winds were so strong that ships were heeled over by the force of the wind alone, leaving little margin if they were thrown by a swell. Water was being taken in quantity through ventilators, blower intakes, and every topside opening. The winds were tearing off masts and equipment on top, but were so powerful that men could not go outside to jettison topside weights that were making ships even more top-heavy. Monaghan was still trying to maintain her station, not yet given the order to break formation when she lost power. Joseph McCrane, a water tender second class, recalled, We started to roll, heaving to the starboard, and everyone was holding on to something and praying as hard as he could. We knew that we had lost our power and we were dead in the water. We must have taken about 7 or 8 rolls in the starboard when she went over on her side. Monaghan went down at 11:45. She was the first ship lost to the storm. Her crew was mostly trapped. McCrane was one of only 6 men of a crew of some 260 to survive. Next to go was Uss Spence, a more modern Fletcher-class destroyer that had been commissioned in January of 1943. Spence was extremely low on fuel and had jettisoned ballast during an attempt to refuel. She tried to take seawater into her tanks for ballast, but the sea was too rough. As she was tossed in the 50 to 60-foot swells and the 110-knot gale, seawater entered the fire room and shorted out the electrical system. U.S. Naval Reserve Lieutenant Junior Grade Alfonso Carruchnas described the ship's last moments. She took a 70-degree roll and recovered, but the next huge wave rolled her on her side, where she hit with a terrific crash. Men were trapped in their compartments, where they had sought shelter from the heavy seas washing over the entire deck. Only a handful were able to make it free of the ship, clinging to whatever debris floated. With a crew of 341, only 24 survived. USS Hull, another Farragut-class destroyer, went next. The ship became impossible to steer, being as her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander James A. Marks, described, blown bodily by wind and sea. Marks went on, I had served in destroyers in some of the worst wind and seas in the North Atlantic, and believed that no wind could be worse than what I had just witnessed. The force of the wind laid the ship steadily on her starboard side and held her in the water until the seas came flowing into the pilot house itself. Marks was one of 72 survivors. 202 of Hull's crew were lost. Hull's story was said to have inspired portions of the novel and later film and play The Caine Mutiny by Herman Walk. The John C. Butler-class destroyer escort, USS Tabor, managed to stay afloat by shifting fuel to the port tanks to compensate for the starboard list when it became apparent that the ship would have to ride out the storm with wind and sea on the port beam. But as the ship rolled as much as 72 degrees, the stays holding the main mast started breaking. By 6:30, the ship had lost her mast, and thus her radio. The storm died down by evening, and crewmen were trying to rig an emergency antenna to restore communications. One of the crewmen heard a shout. It was a survivor from USS Hull. Despite the damage, and with swells high, Tabor began a box grid search for survivors. By noon the next day, Tabor saved 41 survivors from USS Hull, and 14 from USS Spence. The crews on the light aircraft carriers were struggling with another problem. In the swells, aircraft were being torn loose, no matter how carefully tied down. and the storm made deck work trying to secure planes nearly impossible. Planes were torn off the deck and lost, or worse, thrown around, crushing other planes and, in some cases, starting fires. In all, 146 planes were lost or damaged beyond repair. Aboard the Independence-class light carrier USS Monterey, 5 aircraft had blown off the deck already when, at 9:08 a.m., the hangar deck reported a plane was adrift, followed 2 minutes later by an explosion. The plane on the hangar deck that had gone adrift had broken from its moorings and crashed into another plane, puncturing both planes' gas tanks, causing an explosion and fire. The fire spread throughout the deck, and smoke from vents filled the engine rooms. The captain had to halt the ship to keep enough steam pressure to keep the fire pumps working. Several more fires were spread throughout the ship through the open ventilation system. Halsey ordered the captain, Stuart Ingersoll, to abandon ship, but Ingersoll was determined to save the ship. Careful damage control slowly brought the fires under control. Monterey lost 18 aircraft in the storm and fires, and 2/3 of the hangar deck was gutted. One of the officers, a young lieutenant junior grade who served as general quarters officer of the deck, was nearly swept overboard by a 70-foot wave. He managed to grab a catwalk as the wave pulled him over the side and make it up to the bridge. The captain ordered him to check on the fire and report. He managed to make it down through the pitching vessel and provide the captain with a report, and then continued his duties. He was one of the officers whose calm service saved the ship. The event received only a brief mention in the autobiography that the former University of Michigan football star wrote 35 years later, with relatively more time dedicated to his later service as 38th President of the United States. In addition to the loss of the 3 destroyers, the storm, which was unofficially called Typhoon Cobra, or sometimes Halsey's Typhoon, did damage to 31 other ships, including significant damage to 5 U.S. aircraft carriers. In all, 790 sailors and Marines were lost in the storm, with another 80 injured. Some of the survivors of the sunken destroyers were adrift for 52 hours before being rescued, and had drifted as far away as 75 miles. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, said of the storm, "It represented a more crippling blow to the Third Fleet than might be expected to suffer in anything less than a major action." George Dyer, captain of the carrier Astoria, said, "The storm had dealt us a blow which the enemy would have liked very much to deliver himself." The Third Fleet was damaged by another typhoon in June, killing 6 men and damaging 31 ships, although no ships were lost. The 2 storms led to the creation of a more robust infrastructure for tracking Pacific storms that eventually became the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, which is today responsible for issuing tropical cyclone warnings for the U.S. military in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Court of Inquiry faulted Halsey and said that he had made errors of judgment, but stopped short of recommending any sanctions. Admiral Nimitz wrote a letter to the fleet that, among other things, faulted commanders for relying too much on outside information about storms instead of using age-old practices of self-reliance and caution. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.